Welcome to Boring Past Times, the channel where history drifts slowly, like the turning of old pages. Here, you'll find not battles or heroes, but the quiet details of life long ago, the forgotten routines, the small choices, and the everyday struggles that shaped our world. So lie back, close your eyes, and let the past guide you gently into rest. Story 1. The Making of a Fortune. Rockefeller's early life and rise. If you were to picture John D. Rockefeller, America's first billionaire, you might imagine the stern-faced industrial titan, sitting behind an oak desk, his ledgers filled with numbers, his hands resting on the levers of the oil empire that reshaped modern capitalism. But before he was the founder of Standard Oil, before he was the world's richest man, Rockefeller was a child born into the uncertainty of rural 19th century America. His earliest years, filled with modest work, careful accounting, and strict discipline, explain more about his later empire than any single financial deal. Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in a small farmhouse in Richford, New York. The place was not remarkable, nor was the family wealthy. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a traveling peddler, sometimes described as a con man. His trade was selling cancer cures, miracle tonics, and herbal remedies to unsuspecting townsfolk. He was not a stable presence in the home, often gone for months at a time. His mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, was his opposite, deeply religious, frugal, and determined to hold the household together despite the absence of reliable income. The family soon moved from Richford to Moravia, New York, and later to Oviedo. These small towns of upstate New York, nestled among fields and creeks, were not bustling cities, but quiet, agricultural communities. Rockefeller's world was shaped by chores, church-going, and his mother's lessons about thrift. From a young age, he absorbed the idea that every penny mattered. He later recalled with pride that his mother taught him to keep track of all his small expenses. A nickel saved was more valuable to him than a quarter wasted. Young John was fascinated by numbers. While other children might have run carefree in the fields, Rockefeller kept small notebooks. He would record the prices of goods, keep lists of chores, and note the smallest earnings he could gather. He raised turkeys and sold potatoes to neighbors, always counting carefully what he earned. There was a seriousness to him, even as a boy. Later in life, when he controlled the most powerful company in America, he would still insist on tracking his personal expenditures with precision. To Rockefeller, success began not in grand ventures, but in the small mastery of order. But this careful nature was also shaped by necessity. His father was unreliable with money, sometimes leaving the family in hardship. It was his mother, Eliza, who modeled thrift and hard work. She was a devout Baptist, instilling in John a sense of religious duty. From her, he learned that money was not only to be earned, but to be used responsibly, and always with an eye toward charity. This early tension between his father's recklessness and his mother's restraint shaped the man who would come to embody both ruthless capitalism and generous philanthropy in Cleveland, Ohio, where the Rockefellers moved in the early 1850s. Young John attended school until about age 16. He was a capable but not extraordinary student, especially in mathematics, where he showed patience and steadiness. He did not display the brilliance of a prodigy, but rather the slow, methodical habits that would later define his career. At 16, Rockefeller sought work. It was 1855, and the United States was on the edge of expansion and industrial change. Railroads were spreading, canals were busy with trade, and cities like Cleveland were growing with new industries. Rockefeller walked the streets in search of employment, knocking on office doors. He dressed carefully, determined to present himself with seriousness. Eventually, he was hired as an assistant bookkeeper for Hewitt and Tuttle, a small produce shipping firm. His pay was modest, 50 cents a day. But for Rockefeller, this was not just a job. It was an education in business itself. He watched how goods moved, how accounts were settled, how small margins of profit were calculated and protected. He learned that reliability, showing up every day, working quietly and steadily, was noticed by employers. It was a lesson that would serve him for decades. He later looked back on that first job as a sacred moment. He often referred to September 26, 1855, the day he was hired, as a kind of personal holiday. He celebrated it each year, even as a billionaire, calling it the day he first entered business life. To him, that first ledger, that first careful balancing of numbers, mattered more than any oil while he would later control. Meanwhile, his father's shadow loomed. William Avery Rockefeller, often called Big Bill, was a man who lived by charm and deception. He sold elixirs and patent medicines, claiming miraculous cures. Townspeople were often left swindled, and the family name was not always spoken with respect. Big Bill had a reputation as both a trickster and a wanderer, sometimes disappearing for long stretches. For John, this instability reinforced his own desire for the opposite: stability, order, and predictability. He would later become known for his quiet demeanor, his avoidance of unnecessary risk, and his obsession with efficiency. Where his father had been unreliable, John became relentlessly reliable. Where his father chased quick profits, John sought steady, compounding returns. The young Rockefeller learned to live with a kind of double inheritances. Father's boldness and his mother's caution both shaped his business style, daring enough to see opportunity where others did not, but cautious enough to control every variable possible. By the time Rockefeller was a teenager, he was already lending money at interest to neighbors. He had saved enough from small jobs to act, in effect, as a miniature banker. He charged fair but firm interest rates, carefully recording every cent. This gave him an early understanding of credit, debt, and the power of capital. In his early 20s, he formed a partnership in the produce trade, buying and selling grain, meats, and other goods. The business was modest but steady, and Rockefeller's reputation grew. He was quiet but dependable, known for his seriousness and honesty. People trusted him with money because he treated even small sums as sacred responsibilities. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Rockefeller did not join the battlefield. Instead, he continued in business, finding ways to profit from wartime demands. He later hired substitutes to serve in his place, a common practice among wealthier men at the time. For him, the war years were not marked by glory in combat, but by steady profits and expanding business connections. By the early 1860s, Rockefeller had money saved, experience in trade, and a growing reputation as a disciplined businessman. The timing could not have been more significant. For just then, a new industry was emerging in Pennsylvania, the drilling and refining of petroleum oil. At first, oil was a curiosity, used for lamps and lubricants. But as demand grew, the possibilities expanded. Rockefeller saw opportunity, but he did not rush headlong like many speculators. Where others gambled on quick fortunes, he studied carefully. He watched the prices, the costs of refining, the instability of the market. He saw not just oil, but an entire industry waiting to be organized. It was this patience, rooted in the lessons of his childhood, that set him apart. Rockefeller's ability to count every penny, to weigh every decision, to think in decades rather than months, would soon transform him from a careful bookkeeper into the master of an empire. As you imagine young John Rockefeller, notebook in hand, counting the coins from a neighbor's purchase of potatoes, or carefully entering sums into a ledger in a Cleveland office. It is worth asking, how does a boy so intent on the smallest details come to control the vast machinery of an entire industry? Was it simply discipline, or was there something about his era, his family, and the world of 19th century America that prepared him for such dominance? By the time John D. Rockefeller reached his early 20s, he had already absorbed the lessons that would guide his entire life, built a small partnership in the produce trade, and begun to accumulate a modest amount of capital. Yet he stood at a crossroads. For Rockefeller, the path from careful clerk to oil magnate began not with sudden ambition, but with a slow, calculated series of steps. Cleveland, where Rockefeller had settled with his family, was not yet the sprawling industrial hub it would become, but it was positioned to grow. Situated on Lake Erie, it was a natural center for transportation and trade. Passed through Cleveland, it was in this environment that Rockefeller's partnership in the produce trade had prospered. He and his partner, Maurice B. Clark, supplied foodstuffs during the Civil War. Soldiers and cities needed flour, salt, and pork, and the young firm found steady business. Rockefeller's reputation for honesty, his habit of weighing flour bags twice, or checking invoices with painstaking care gave customers confidence. But even as the produce trade kept his books full, Rockefeller was alert to other opportunities. He watched as barrels of crude oil began arriving in Cleveland from Pennsylvania. At first, oil was a rough, smelly liquid, extracted from shallow wells and transported in leaky barrels. But it had a powerful use. When refined, it could be turned into kerosene, a cleaner burning lamp fuel than whale oil or candles. Demand was rising, and fortunes were being made almost overnight. In 1863, Andrews had been experimenting with ways to improve kerosene production, and Rockefeller saw in him the technical counterpart to his own financial discipline. The refinery was modest at first, but Rockefeller quickly recognized its potential. He studied every aspect of the business: the cost of barrels, the price of transportation, the yield from each batch of crude. He believed that the true power in the industry lay not in drilling wells, but in controlling the transformation and distribution of oil once it left the ground. It was a strategy rooted in his character. Rockefeller had no interest in gambling on uncertain gushers. He preferred steady, controllable processes. Refining was not glamorous, but it was essential. Rockefeller applied his bookkeeper's mind to every decision. He insisted on detailed accounts, recording every expense in neat columns. He scrutinized waste, constantly searching for ways to turn byproducts into profit. Where others threw away gasoline and lubricants, Rockefeller asked how they could be sold. Every waste stream became, in his mind, a potential source of revenue. He also negotiated aggressively. He demanded better shipping rates from railroads, better deals from barrel makers, and better terms from suppliers. His quiet but firm persistence won him advantages that competitors often overlooked. To Rockefeller, small percentages mattered. A 1-cent saving on each gallon of oil, multiplied across thousands of barrels, meant fortunes over time. These habits, so dull in description, were revolutionary in practice. Discipline also led to conflict. Morris Clark, his partner, was more impulsive and less patient than Rockefeller. The two clashed over reinvestment, expansion, and control. Clark was willing to take risks. Rockefeller preferred measured growth. By 1865, their differences came to a head. In an auction between the partners, Rockefeller bid decisively and won, purchasing Clark's stake for $72,500, significant sum at the time. At just 25 years old, Rockefeller became the master of his own company. He renamed it Rockefeller and Andrews, with Samuel Andrews continuing as the technical mind of the refinery. This moment was a turning point. For the first time, Rockefeller was fully in control, able to implement his methods without compromise. His vision of discipline, order, and expansion would now shape the company's future. In the years that followed, planning, he invested in more refineries, built his own barrel-making plant to cut costs, and purchased warehouses for storage in Cleveland, and one of the largest in the nation. The scale of his operations gave him advantages that smaller rivals could not match. He could produce kerosene more cheaply, ship it more reliably, and offer it at lower prices while still turning a profit. His competitors began to feel the pressure. Some sold out to him, others struggled to keep pace. Rockefeller did not boast or display dramatic gestures. He moved quietly, methodically, always expanding his control. Part of his success came from his management style. Rockefeller was not a loud or flamboyant leader. He was calm, reserved, and soft-spoken. Employees described him as dignified, sometimes stern, but fair. He demanded precision in work, yet he rewarded loyalty. He also preferred to remain in the background, letting others take public attention. While speculators shouted about oil strikes, Rockefeller worked in silence, building systems and structures. To him, true power did not lie in appearances, but in control over processes. Even in these early years, when he purchased a rival refinery, he often kept its owners or managers employed, giving them roles within his growing company. In this way, he expanded not only his assets, but his network of talent. The Civil War had ended in 1865, and America was entering a period of reconstruction and industrial expansion. Railroads spread westward, cities grew, and factories multiplied. Oil fit perfectly into this new economy, providing cheap lighting for homes and businesses. Rockefeller's decision to focus on refining rather than drilling positioned him at the heart of this growth. Wells could dry up, but refining would always be needed as long as oil was pumped. His company stood on solid ground. He also avoided the speculative frenzy that ruined many. When prices fell, Rockefeller, by contrast, expanded steadily, focusing on efficiency rather than wild growth. He described himself as bound to be rich, not through luck, but through careful accumulation. By the end of the 1860s, Rockefeller's ambitions had grown. He no longer sought merely to run a refinery. He wanted to organize the oil industry itself. He saw chaos all around him, dozens of small refiners competing, prices swinging wildly, waste and inefficiency everywhere. Order had to be imposed. His goal was simple but radical: eliminate waste. Would prosper. Consumers would receive cheaper, more reliable kerosene. Producers would avoid ruinous competition. But in this vision lay the seeds of monopoly. Yet already the master of Cleveland's refining industry. He had begun as a bookkeeper, earning 50 cents a day, and now he controlled millions of gallons of oil each year. Could one man or one company truly control the vast and unpredictable world of oil? By the beginning of the 1870s, John D. Rockefeller was no longer simply a successful businessman in Cleveland. He was something more, a man with a vision for how an industry should function. Where most saw opportunity in speculation, he saw danger in unpredictability. His solution was order. He would need to build an organization larger and more powerful than anything the United States had yet witnessed in the late 1860s and early 1870s. Oil refining was a chaotic, boom-and-bust industry. Hundreds of small refineries sprang up in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York, many operated by men with little experience. The barriers to entry were low. A modest investment could set up a crude still and begin refining kerosene. But the result was disastrous. Refiners overproduced, flooding the market with kerosene. Barrels of kerosene sometimes exploded when used in lamps, damaging the industry's reputation. For Rockefeller, this chaos was unacceptable. To him, waste was a sin, both morally and economically. He believed the industry needed to be disciplined, consolidated, and controlled. Rockefeller, with his vast storage, could weather downturns and even use them to his advantage. What made Standard Oil unique was not any single innovation, but the way Rockefeller integrated them all. Railroads, pipelines, barrel factories, refineries, and storage tanks were not independent businesses, but parts of a unified system. Oil flowed seamlessly from well to consumer under Standard Oil's direction. This vertical integration, as it later came to be called, gave the company extraordinary power. Rivals might compete in one part of the chain, but Rockefeller controlled the entire chain. Even if a competitor refined crude oil, they often had to rely on Standard Oil's transportation or storage. It was this system that made Standard Oil less a company and more an empire. For smaller refiners, Standard Oil's expansion was devastating. Many could not match the company's efficiency or its transportation advantages. Rockefeller often offered them a choice: sell to Standard Oil or face ruin. Some accepted his offers and even prospered within the larger company. Others resisted, only to find themselves squeezed out. Critics saw this as ruthless monopoly building. Rockefeller defended it as natural selection in business. The day of combination is here to stay, he declared. In his view, small, inefficient refiners had no right to survive when a better system existed. By the late 1870s and early 1880s, Standard Oil was not just an American giant, it was a global force. The company exported kerosene to Europe, Asia, and Africa. Lamps burning Standard Oil fuel lit homes in London, villages in India, and outposts in China. The company built overseas distribution networks, warehouses, and marketing campaigns. Barrels stamped with Standard Oil's insignia became symbols of modernity and progress. To Rockefeller, this was proof that his vision of order served not only his company but also the world. Throughout this expansion, Rockefeller remained personally modest. He lived quietly in Cleveland, working from a simple office and avoiding public spectacle. He reinvested profits into the business, rarely indulging in luxury. To outsiders, it was baffling. The richest man in America, living without ostentation. Yet for Rockefeller, wealth was not for display. It was for building systems, imposing order, and fulfilling what he saw as his mission by mastering barrels, railroads, pipelines, and storage. Rockefeller had turned Standard Oil into more than a company. It was an industrial empire, stretching from Pennsylvania oil fields to the lamps of the world. Yet this very empire, so carefully built, raised an uneasy question. How long could such power remain unchallenged? Would the same forces of competition and politics that destroyed smaller rivals one day turn against Rockefeller himself? By the early 1880s, Standard Oil was no longer simply one of many players in the petroleum industry. It was the dominant force, controlling nearly every step of production, refining, and distribution. Yet this dominance had not been won in a single stroke. It was the result of a slow, methodical campaign to absorb, outmaneuver, or eliminate competitors. Rockefeller did not rely on flamboyant gestures or dramatic takeovers. Instead, he practiced what might be called the art of quiet conquest. His methods were often invisible to the public, hidden in contracts, shipping rates, and private negotiations. But the effect was unmistakable. Rivals vanished, independence dissolved, and Standard Oil became synonymous with the oil industry itself. The oil business in the 1860s and 1870s had been characterized by volatility. Prices soared and collapsed. Refiners appeared and disappeared, and fortunes rose and fell overnight. In such an environment, Rockefeller's insistence on stability was unusual. He sought not the thrill of speculation, but the security of control. To him, competition was not a healthy mechanism of progress, as many Americans believed. It was wasteful, destructive, and irrational. Cutthroat competition, he once remarked, means everybody cutting each other's throats. His solution was consolidation, where rivals built new refineries to chase rising prices. Rockefeller acquired or shut down excess capacity, where competitors undercut each other recklessly. Rockefeller stabilized prices by controlling supply. To him, the elimination of competition was not merely self-serving, but a service to the industry and the public. One of Rockefeller's most common strategies was simply to buy out competitors. He approached rival refiners with calm persistence, offering them a choice: sell to Standard Oil at a fair price, or attempt to fight a company with overwhelming advantages. Many chose to sell, often relieved to escape the volatility of the business. Rockefeller had a reputation for fairness in these negotiations. He did not always pay top dollar, but he often gave former owners positions within Standard Oil or shares in the larger company. Many who sold out became wealthy through their continued association with Standard. Yet the underlying reality was clear. refusal was dangerous. Competitors who tried to resist often found themselves squeezed by Standard Oil's lower prices, better transportation rates, and wider distribution networks. Some fought bitterly, but few survived. Beyond direct purchases, Rockefeller used subtler methods. Standard Oil negotiated exclusive contracts with railroads, ensuring that rivals paid higher shipping costs. It pressured suppliers of barrels and chemicals to favor Standard's orders. It flooded markets with cheap kerosene when a competitor tried to gain a foothold, driving prices so low that only Standard could endure the losses. These tactics were rarely publicized. To the outside world, Standard Oil appeared calm, efficient, and almost boring in its operations. But beneath the surface, it was a machine designed to strangle competition quietly. Perhaps the most infamous episode of Rockefeller's early consolidation was the creation of the South Improvement Company in 1872. This arrangement, made with major railroads, would have given Standard Oil secret rebates and drawbacks, effectively raising costs for all competitors. When news of the deal leaked, oil producers and refiners across Pennsylvania erupted in anger. They organized protests, boycotted railroads, and forced the plan's cancellation. The scandal tarnished Rockefeller's image, painting him as a conspirator against fair competition. Yet, even in failure, the episode revealed Rockefeller's strategy: use quiet agreements with powerful allies to tilt the playing field. Although the South Improvement Company collapsed, Standard Oil continued to secure favorable rates through less public means. As Standard Oil expanded beyond Cleveland, new challenges arose. It now controlled refineries in New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and other cities, but operating across state lines posed legal difficulties, since corporations were often restricted by state charters. Rockefeller's solution was innovative: the trust. In 1882, Standard Oil created the Standard Oil Trust, in which shareholders of dozens of affiliated companies exchanged their stock for trust certificates, managed by a board of trustees. This structure allowed Rockefeller to coordinate a nationwide empire while skirting restrictive laws. The trust was among the first of its kind in American business history. It gave Standard Oil unprecedented control and efficiency, but it also sparked growing unease. Critics saw it as a dangerous concentration of power, a corporate entity that operated beyond the reach of state governments. Not all competitors surrendered. Quietly, some fought, forming associations to demand fair treatment from railroads or to resist buyouts. Independent refiners in Pennsylvania and Ohio occasionally rallied together, attempting to challenge Standard's dominance. But Rockefeller had patience on his side. He could afford to lower prices, absorb losses, and wait until his rivals collapsed. He once said, "The way to make money is to buy when blood is running in the streets." In the oil industry, the blood was often the bankruptcy of small refiners, which Standard then absorbed at bargain prices. Even when competitors survived, they often became dependent on Standard Oil pipelines or storage. Independence was more illusion than reality. By the mid-1880s, Standard Oil's dominance was nearly complete. It controlled more than 90% of America's refining capacity. Consumers continued to enjoy cheap, reliable kerosene, but the press and public opinion grew increasingly suspicious. Journalists began to write about the company's secret deals and overwhelming power. Farmers complained about unfair railroad rates tied to Standard's influence. Politicians debated whether such concentration of power was dangerous to democracy itself. Rockefeller, however, remained largely silent. He rarely spoke publicly, preferring to let his results speak for themselves. He defended his company in simple terms. Standard Oil brought order to chaos, efficiency to waste, and reliability to consumers. To him, criticism was merely the voice of those who had failed. To adapt what made Rockefeller unusual was not just his methods, but his demeanor. Unlike later industrialists who flaunted wealth or power, Rockefeller maintained a quiet, restrained style. He worked long hours, lived modestly, and continued to record personal expenses in neat ledgers. His conquests were not announced with fanfare. They unfolded silently in contracts and acquisitions. This calm persistence was both his strength and his most unsettling trait. To his allies, it was evidence of discipline and integrity. To his enemies, it was the mask of a ruthless monopolist. By the mid-1880s, Standard Oil had transformed the American oil industry. Competition, once fierce and chaotic, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Rivals had been absorbed, outmaneuvered, or crushed, often with little fanfare. Rockefeller's empire now stretched across the nation, coordinated through the new structure of the trust. Yet with power came scrutiny. Could such a vast, invisible machine remain unchecked? Or would the very scale of Standard Oil invite the kind of opposition that no private company could silence forever? By the late 19th century, Standard Oil had grown from a cluster of Cleveland refineries into a vast, interlocking empire. Its kerosene lamps illuminated homes across America. Its lubricants kept factory machines humming, and its profits towered above those of nearly every other business in the world. Yet, its very success raised questions that would echo through the decades. Could one company grow too powerful? Could the pursuit of efficiency, stability, and wealth cross into the realm of monopoly, undermining the principles of free enterprise that Americans cherished? This section tells the story of how Standard Oil's dominance reached its peak, how critics rallied against it, and how the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately stepped in, forever shaping the relationship between business and government. By the 1890s, Standard Oil controlled about 90% of the American refining industry. It owned pipelines, storage facilities, barrel factories, and fleets of tank cars. It dictated the price of kerosene not only in Cleveland or New York, but across the United States and beyond. Consumers often benefited. Kerosene prices fell steadily, from more than 30 cents a gallon in the 1860s to less than 10 cents by the end of the century. Rockefeller proudly pointed to this as evidence that his company's size and efficiency had improved life for ordinary Americans. To him, Standard Oil was proof that monopoly could be benevolent. But to farmers, small refiners, and reformers, the picture looked different. They saw a company that bent railroads to its will, manipulated markets, and eliminated rivals not through innovation but through sheer weight of power. Standard Oil was not merely a business, it was an empire, unaccountable to voters or governments. During these same years, the United States was wrestling with rapid industrialization. Railroads stretched across the continent, steel mills rose in Pennsylvania, and great fortunes accumulated in the hands of men like Carnegie, Morgan, and Rockefeller. Ordinary Americans sometimes marveled at this progress, but often worried about its implications. Small farmers and laborers felt squeezed between giant corporations and indifferent markets. They turned to political movements like the populists, who decried trusts and monopolies as threats to democracy. Journalists investigated secret deals and corrupt practices. Ministers warned that unchecked wealth was morally dangerous. It was in this atmosphere that Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. The law declared illegal every contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of trade. Its language was vague, but its intent was clear. The federal government would no longer ignore monopolies. For the first time, there was a legal tool to challenge companies like Standard Oil. If the Sherman Act was the legal weapon, public opinion was the battlefield. And no single figure did more to shape that opinion than Ida M. Tarbell, a journalist whose father had been a small oil producer in Pennsylvania. In 1902, Tarbell began publishing a series of articles in McClure's magazine titled The History of the Standard Oil Company. Her work was meticulous, drawing on interviews, documents, and years of research. She described in detail how Rockefeller and Standard Oil had secured secret rebates, crushed rivals, and built a monopoly. Tarbell's writing was calm, factual, and devastating. She did not rant, she explained. Readers came to see Standard Oil not as a natural success story, but as a carefully engineered domination of an industry. Tarbell's series became one of the most famous works of muckraking journalism in American history. Rockefeller never directly engaged with Tarbell, dismissing her as a lady writer. Yet her work did lasting damage to his reputation, portraying him as cold, secretive, and ruthless. To many Americans, the oil king became the very symbol of corporate monopoly. By the early 1900s, federal and state governments had begun to test the Sherman Act against Standard Oil. Lawsuits were filed in Ohio, Missouri, and eventually at the national level. Standard's lawyers fought back, insisting that the company's size was the result of efficiency, not coercion. They argued that consumers had benefited from lower prices and better products. For years, cases moved slowly through the courts. Standard Oil adjusted its structure, dissolving the formal trust in 1892, but reorganizing as a holding company in New Jersey. This new arrangement continued to centralize control while claiming to comply with state laws. It was a cat-and-mouse game. Regulators pursued the company, while Rockefeller's lawyers devised new structures to stay one step ahead. The decisive moment came with Standard Oil Co. of New Jersey v. United States, argued before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1910 and decided in 1911. At issue was whether Standard Oil's vast network of acquisitions, contracts, and agreements violated the Sherman Act. The government's case, bolstered by Tarbell's exposes and years of public resentment, painted Standard as the archetype of monopoly power. The company's sheer dominance, they argued, restrained trade and crushed competition. Regardless of whether prices had fallen, Standard's defense emphasized its efficiency and the benefits it had delivered to consumers. If success was punished, they asked, would not innovation itself be discouraged? After months of deliberation, the court delivered its ruling. Standard Oil was indeed a monopoly in violation of the Sherman Act. The company was ordered to be broken up into 34 separate entities. Among them were names that would later become giants in their own right: Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco. For Rockefeller, the ruling was both a defeat and a strange sort of triumph. He had long since retired from daily management, living quietly at his estate in New York. When news of the breakup reached him, he was unfazed. In fact, he became wealthier. Shareholders in Standard Oil received proportional shares in the newly created companies, many of which quickly increased in value. Rockefeller's fortune soared, making him the first American billionaire. The empire had been dismantled, but its pieces continued to dominate the oil industry. The breakup of Standard Oil became one of the most famous moments in American legal and economic history. It established the federal government's authority to regulate large corporations and gave real power to the Sherman Act. Future cases against steel, railroads, and even modern technology companies would cite the precedent set in 1911. For the public, the case confirmed a belief that unchecked corporate power could be dangerous and had to be balanced by government oversight. Yet it also left a paradox. Standard Oil's efficiency had undeniably lowered prices and improved supply. The line between healthy competition and destructive monopoly remained difficult to draw. When the Supreme Court dissolved Standard Oil, it ended one of the most extraordinary corporate experiments in American history. For nearly half a century, John D. Rockefeller had pursued his vision of order and control, turning chaos into stability, competition into consolidation. He had built an empire so vast it could no longer stand intact, and yet, even in its broken form, Standard Oil lived on in Exxon's gas stations, Chevron's refineries, Mobil's oil fields. The pieces of Rockefeller's creation continued to shape the world long after the trust was gone. The man who had once counted pennies as a boy in rural New York had built a fortune so large that even the Supreme Court could not truly erase it. Story 3. Life Beyond the Ledger. Rockefeller at home. When the name John D. Rockefeller comes up, the usual images are those of towering refineries, barrels of kerosene, or courtroom battles over monopolies. Yet, for the man himself, the center of life was not found in oil or in empire, but in quieter places: his family, his faith, and the rhythms of devotion that shaped his days. This section explores the deeply personal side of Rockefeller, the household where he lived, the faith that anchored him, and the family bonds that gave him comfort long after his battles in business were over. Despite being one of the richest men in the world, Rockefeller lived with a simplicity that often startled visitors. He was not given to lavish display. Even when Standard Oil was dominating global markets, he and his wife, Laura Spelman Rockefeller, maintained a home life that was disciplined, orderly, and without excess. Laura, whom John affectionately called Seti, was his partner in both faith and restraint. The daughter of a devout Baptist family in Ohio, she shared his belief that wealth was a trust from God, meant to be stewarded carefully. Together, they built a household where discipline was prized above indulgence. Their children grew up with rules about spending, charity, and behavior, while other wealthy families of the Gilded Age surrounded themselves with European art and glittering social events. The Rockefellers cultivated modesty. Extravagance, in John's eyes, was wasteful, and waste was a sin. Rockefeller's Baptist upbringing was not a youthful phase that faded with success. It was the guiding principle of his life. As a boy, he had given his first dimes to the church. As a man, he continued the practice, donating regularly and generously. His ledger books often recorded gifts of just 10 cents alongside larger donations, a habit that reflected his conviction that giving was as important as earning. Critics accused him of hypocrisy, of hoarding wealth while avoiding the very luxuries it could provide. Admirers, on the other hand, saw wisdom, a man who did not allow fortune to corrupt his soul. For Rockefeller himself, the answer was straightforward. His wealth was not for personal indulgence, but for stewardship, for business stability, and eventually for philanthropy. In Rockefeller's daily habits, we see not a life of spectacle, but of structure. He chose predictability over extravagance, discipline over indulgence. The billionaire who controlled vast empires of oil and money lived by simple routines that echoed his mother's early lessons: rise early, work hard, give faithfully, and live within bounds. Yet this raises a question. If Rockefeller did not use his wealth for personal luxury, how did he choose to spend it? What became of the fortune that seemed almost too large to measure? For most of his life, John D. Rockefeller lived in houses that were substantial but not ostentatious. His homes reflected the same sense of discipline that guided his daily routine: order, quiet, and usefulness. Yet, as his fortune grew, he created retreats that allowed him to balance the burdens of business with rest, health, and family time. These estates, far removed from the clamor of oil fields, railroads, and corporate battles, for a glimpse into how America's first billionaire truly spent his leisure hours. In the 1870s, Rockefeller purchased Forest Hill, an estate near Cleveland, Ohio. At the time, Cleveland was the center of Standard Oil's operations, and Forest Hill became both a retreat and a symbol of stability. The estate was vast, with rolling hills, meadows, and woodlands. The main house, a large but plain structure, sat surrounded by porches and gardens. For Rockefeller, Forest Hill was less about grandeur and more about health. Fresh air, quiet spaces, and open landscapes were essential to him. He believed that physical environment shaped moral and spiritual well-being, and Forest Hill offered an antidote to the pressures of corporate life. Here he walked, played with his children, and devoted time to family. He also pursued his favorite outdoor activity, golf. The wide lawns and open fields of Forest Hill became, in effect, his personal course. Rockefeller loved the game not for competition, but for the exercise and calm rhythm it provided. By the 1890s, Rockefeller sought another retreat, one closer to New York, where Standard Oil's influence and his philanthropic efforts increasingly centered. He purchased Pocantico Hills, an expansive property overlooking the Hudson River. The estate would eventually grow to thousands of acres, including farmland, woodlands, gardens, and several large houses. The most famous residence, later called Kykert, was completed after Rockefeller's time, but became the family seat for generations. At Pocantico, Rockefeller lived out the same simplicity that characterized Forest Hill. He enjoyed long walks through the grounds, often with grandchildren or guests. He took pride in the agricultural aspects of the orchards, dairy farms, and gardens, believing that good land should be cultivated and cared for. The property, was not only a home, but a kind of living philosophy. Its well-kept fields and orderly paths reflected Rockefeller's sense of discipline. Visitors noted that he found deep satisfaction in the management of land, as if tending estates was a quieter version of tending an empire. One of Rockefeller's greatest pleasures was gardening. At both Forest Hill and Pocantico, he oversaw extensive plantings, sometimes with his own hands, more often through skilled gardeners who executed his vision. Flowers, shrubs, and trees were arranged with care. He believed beauty in nature was not wasteful, but restorative. For a man so cautious about personal luxury, spending on gardens seemed an exception. Yet even here, the purpose was practical. Gardens provided health, joy, and a reminder of God's creation. Rockefeller's greenhouses produced flowers year-round. He delighted in walking among orchids and roses, marveling at their delicacy. This was not mere indulgence. He often gave cut flowers to friends, neighbors, or churches, turning beauty into generosity. Rockefeller's love of golf became legendary. By the turn of the century, he was regularly seen on the links, dressed plainly, moving steadily from hole to hole. He was not a powerful player, but he was consistent, and he approached the game with the same focus he brought to business: steady progress, shot by shot. He continued golfing well into old age, sometimes using a chair to rest between strokes. Children on the estate recalled being invited to play along, treated with kindness and humor. Beyond golf, Rockefeller's pleasures were modest. He enjoyed music, especially hymns. He liked to hum or sing, sometimes off-key, sometimes with surprising vigor. He read widely scripture most of all, but also newspapers, letters, and occasional histories. He was not a man of fiction. He preferred what was useful, practical, or moral. Unlike many of his wealthy contemporaries, Rockefeller did not host lavish parties. His homes were not centers of glittering social life. Instead, they were places of quiet hospitality. Guests were welcomed warmly, fed simply, and often drawn into walks or conversations about faith, thrift, or family. In this way, Rockefeller stood apart from the Gilded Age elite. Where others built ballrooms and filled them with diamonds, he built gardens and filled them with grandchildren. His estates were less stages for display and more sanctuaries for living according to his principles. For Rockefeller, home was not about showing wealth, but about sustaining life. Forest Hill and Pocantico Hills became symbols of stability in a world of rapid change. They grounded him in nature, in family, and in the simple routines that gave him peace. Visitors sometimes expected opulence and left surprised by modesty. Yet the true grandeur of Rockefeller's estates lay not in their buildings, but in their order, their beauty, and their role as places of quiet retreat. John D. Rockefeller, the richest man of his age, lived his home life in ways that often seemed ordinary. He found joy in gardens, in walking, in golf, in the company of family, and in the careful tending of land. His estates, though vast, were never theaters of extravagance, but landscapes of discipline and renewal. In his homes, one sees the heart of the paradox, a man of extraordinary wealth who chose to live in extraordinary simplicity. And yet, while Rockefeller's own life at home was marked by restraint, his fortune, larger than any individual could ever need, would eventually flow outward in ways that reshaped education, science, and medicine across the world. Story 4. giving away a fortune. Rockefeller, the philanthropist, when John D. Rockefeller was a boy. Long before oil wells and boardrooms, he earned small wages, helping neighbors, raising turkeys, and working as a bookkeeper. From those early years, he followed one simple rule: every dime earned had a portion set aside for giving. His first charitable act, according to his own recollection, was a gift of 6 cents to his church, a tithe from his meager pocket money. This habit of giving, small though it was in his youth, never left him. It grew in proportion with his wealth. Just as he calculated every business transaction with precision, so too he tracked his donations. His ledgers recorded gifts to Sunday schools, local churches, missionary societies, and neighbors in need. By the time he was a young man in Cleveland, his giving already exceeded the wages of ordinary workers. Rockefeller's philanthropy was never casual. It was rooted in the strict Baptist faith that guided nearly every decision he made. He believed wealth was a trust from God, and that men of means carried a duty to use their riches wisely. This belief did not mean impulsive generosity. In fact, he disliked indiscriminate giving, seeing it as wasteful or even harmful. Instead, he applied the same logic to philanthropy that he applied to business: systematic, organized, and focused on efficiency. To Rockefeller, the goal was not simply to relieve immediate need, but to solve problems at their root. In the 1860s and 1870s, when his fortune was still in its infancy, Rockefeller gave primarily to churches, seminaries, and religious charities. He supported Baptist institutions in Ohio and New York, funded missionary efforts, and contributed to the training of ministers. Yet, even in these early years, his giving was notable for its scale. He donated to schools for freedmen in the South after the Civil War, supporting education for newly emancipated Black Americans. He also funded the University of Chicago, which would become one of the most significant educational institutions in the country. By the 1880s, his giving had reached millions, on almost unimaginable sum in an age when most families lived on a few $100s per year. Perhaps the clearest example of Rockefeller's early philanthropic vision was his role in creating the University of Chicago in 1889. He pledged large sums, ultimately more than $30 million, to establish and sustain the university. Rockefeller's funding built the campus, recruited faculty, and secured the institution's financial stability. He insisted on rigorous academic standards and sought to create a world-class university that would rival older, wealthier Eastern schools like Harvard and Yale. For Rockefeller, the University of Chicago was more than an act of generosity. It was a demonstration of his belief that education was the key to long-term improvement. He did not simply want to feed the hungry. He wanted to create institutions that would teach future generations how to provide for themselves. By the late 19th century, Rockefeller's wealth had grown so large that his giving reached unprecedented levels. Newspapers reported on his donations with awe, sometimes with suspicion. Could any one man be so generous? Was it genuine charity, or a way to repair his reputation, damaged by years of criticism over Standard Oil's practices? Rockefeller himself seemed untroubled by such speculation. To him, the act of giving was duty, not spectacle. He often said, "God gave me my money," and saw himself merely as a steward. What mattered was not the praise or blame of men, but whether his fortune was being used in accordance with divine purpose. Still, it was impossible to ignore the timing. As Rockefeller gave more, the public debates about his wealth intensified. Muckraking journalists like Ida Tarbell exposed Standard Oil's ruthless practices, painting him as a monopolist who crushed competition and exploited ordinary workers. To many Americans, Rockefeller was both a figure of suspicion and a symbol of excess wealth. Could his philanthropy offset the means by which he had gained his fortune? Could charity erase monopoly? Rockefeller himself offered little defense. He rarely engaged critics directly. Instead, he continued giving, building, and funding institutions. In time, his philanthropy would grow so vast and so enduring that it would reshape the way Americans thought about wealth and charity. By the dawn of the 20th century, Rockefeller had moved far beyond the 6 cents he gave as a boy. His donations reached into millions, creating universities, supporting churches, and funding missions. Yet the deeper question remained: was this simply charity on a larger scale? Or was Rockefeller building a new model of philanthropy, one that would seek not only to relieve suffering, but to eliminate its causes? By the turn of the 20th century, Rockefeller's giving had reached a scale never before seen in human history. His personal gifts, while vast, were becoming too scattered, too difficult to manage through simple ledgers and checks. To give away such wealth required a system, an institution, and above all, a philosophy. What emerged from this need was the modern concept of the philanthropic foundation. Until Rockefeller's time, wealthy Americans typically gave in ways that were direct but limited: donations to churches, support for local schools, or relief for the poor. These were acts of charity, meant to ease immediate burdens. Rockefeller sought something different. He wanted to attack the root causes of social problems, much as a business might address inefficiencies or waste. In his view, indiscriminate charity could do more harm than good, fostering dependency rather than independence. What mattered was finding solutions that would multiply benefits over time. This approach, which he sometimes referred to as scientific philanthropy, applied logic, efficiency, and long-term planning to the act of giving. One of Rockefeller's first major experiments in organized giving was the General Education Board, founded in 1902. Its mission was broad: to promote education in the United States without distinction of race, sex, or creed. In practice, it poured enormous resources into schools across the South, particularly in the education of African Americans and rural populations. At a time when Southern schools were underfunded and segregated, the board provided crucial support for teachers, facilities, and training programs. By the time it had completed its work decades later, the General Education Board had distributed more than $300 million, staggering sum for education in an era when annual teacher salaries were often less than $500. If education was Rockefeller's first great philanthropic frontier, medicine soon became his second. He was deeply concerned about the state of public health in America and abroad, where diseases such as hookworm, malaria, and yellow fever ravaged communities. In 1901, he established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, today known as Rockefeller University. Modeled after German research laboratories, it was the first biomedical research institute in the United States. Its scientists would go on to win numerous Nobel Prizes and make breakthroughs in virology, genetics, and cell biology. But Rockefeller's most dramatic medical effort was the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission, which launched a campaign in the American South to eradicate hookworm disease. Hookworm, often overlooked by wealthier Americans, caused anemia, lethargy, and developmental delays in poor rural populations. The campaign not only reduced infection rates dramatically, but also brought attention to the connections between disease and poverty. In 1913, Rockefeller expanded this work globally with the creation of the Rockefeller Foundation. Its mission was vast: the well-being of mankind throughout the world. The Rockefeller Foundation quickly became one of the most influential organizations of the 20th century. With an initial endowment of $100 million, almost unthinkable summit had resources greater than many national governments. Its projects spanned the globe: public health, funding campaigns against yellow fever and malaria in Latin America, Africa, and Asia; medicine, supporting schools of public health, including the one at Johns Hopkins University, which helped define modern medical training, science, and agriculture; backing research that would eventually contribute to the Green Revolution in the mid-20th century, transforming global food production. Education and arts, providing grants to universities, museums, and cultural institutions across the United States and beyond. The Foundation's approach reflected Rockefeller's philosophy: large-scale, carefully planned, and aimed at long-term solutions. Rockefeller was not alone in this movement. His contemporary, Andrew Carnegie, also embraced the idea of philanthropy on a grand scale, famously declaring that the man who dies rich dies disgraced. Yet Rockefeller's methods were distinct. Carnegie tended to focus on libraries and institutions of culture, leaving their use to communities. Rockefeller, by contrast, often focused on systematic reform, improving public health, creating universities, and funding research that would reshape knowledge itself. This shift away from charity and toward philanthropy as social engineering was both admired and feared. To many, it represented progress. To others, it seemed dangerous that private fortunes could wield power greater than elected governments. Not everyone welcomed Rockefeller's foundations. Some critics accused him of trying to launder his reputation. Others feared that concentrated philanthropy gave unelected millionaires undue influence over society. In 1912, when Rockefeller applied for a federal charter for his foundation, Congress balked. Senators openly debated whether any man, no matter how generous, should be allowed to control such sums outside democratic oversight. Eventually, the Rockefeller Foundation was incorporated under New York state law rather than by Congress. Yet, the debate revealed a deep unease with the idea of private wealth shaping public life. By the 1910s, Rockefeller had transformed philanthropy from scattered donations into a global enterprise. His foundations fought disease, built universities, and funded research that changed medicine and agriculture. Yet, a question lingered: could even the most generous philanthropy ever fully separate itself from the shadow of the fortune that created it? By the time John D. Rockefeller entered his later years, his reputation had shifted in remarkable ways. Once vilified as a ruthless monopolist, he was increasingly seen as a benefactor. His philanthropic institutions, education boards, medical research institutes, and the Rockefeller Foundation were reshaping the world in ways that extended far beyond his lifetime. But what did this legacy of giving really mean, and how has it influenced philanthropy today? Rockefeller retired officially from active business in the late 1890s, though he continued to manage his fortune with meticulous attention. By the 1910s, he had turned almost entirely to philanthropy. His later years were spent at his estates, most famously at Pocantico Hills in New York, where he lived quietly, playing golf, enjoying time with his family, and giving interviews that often emphasized the simple values of thrift, faith, and discipline that had shaped his life. He lived to be nearly 98 years old, passing away in 1937, long enough to see his fortune evolve into institutions that carried his name and mission across the globe by the time of his death. Rockefeller's gifts were estimated at over $500 million, equivalent to many billions today. The institutions he created had lasting impact. Rockefeller University, formerly the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, a center for biomedical discovery, whose scientists contributed to breakthroughs in virology, genetics, and cell biology. The Rockefeller Foundation, funding research in agriculture, which later played a role in the Green Revolution, helping prevent famine in parts of Asia and Latin America. Public health campaigns, efforts against hookworm, yellow fever, and malaria altered the health landscapes of entire regions. Education, the General Education Board, and related efforts provided critical support for schools in rural America, especially in the South. These institutions reflected Rockefeller's conviction that wealth should not only be given away, but given away wisely. Even as Rockefeller's philanthropy was praised, critiques did not disappear. Many continued to argue that such immense giving allowed the wealthy to shape society according to their own values, bypassing democratic decision-making. Some asked, was it right that one man could determine the direction of scientific research, public health policy, or education? This debate has never truly ended. In fact, it resurfaces with every new generation of wealthy philanthropists, from Bill Gates to modern tech billionaires who look to Rockefeller's model as both inspiration and precedent. In many ways, Rockefeller's approach became the blueprint for modern philanthropy. His insistence on research, long-term planning, and measurable results distinguished his efforts from traditional charity. Today's global foundations, whether in health, education, or the arts, often follow paths first carved out by Rockefeller and his advisors. This legacy has transformed philanthropy from a private pastime into a recognized sector of society, operating alongside business and government. Yet, even in his later years, Rockefeller remained a figure of paradox. To admirers, he was the man who had shown how wealth could serve humanity. To detractors, he was the original symbol of capitalism's inequalities. His gifts unable to erase the ruthless business practices that had created his fortune. What is clear, however, is that Rockefeller fundamentally changed the conversation about what the wealthy owed to society. He demonstrated, on a scale never before seen, that wealth could be mobilized not only to build personal monuments, but to attempt to solve global problems. When Rockefeller died in 1937, the world stood on the edge of profound changes: the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, and another world war. Yet the institutions he had built endured, carrying forward his vision of philanthropy as a systematic, almost scientific endeavor. The question that lingers is not whether Rockefeller gave generously, he did, beyond measure, but whether philanthropy itself, when concentrated in the hands of the wealthy, can ever be separated from the power dynamics that created such fortunes in the first place. Is philanthropy, then, the highest expression of generosity, or is it another form of control, reshaping the world in ways that reflect not democracy, but the preferences of a single man? Story 5. The End of an Era. Rockefeller's Final Years and Lasting Legacy. When John D. Rockefeller stepped back from the world of active business in the late 1890s, many assumed he would fade quietly into retirement. Yet, for nearly 4 more decades, his name remained in headlines, his actions debated, and his immense fortune a subject of fascination and scrutiny. His final years, stretching into the 1930s, represented not just the closing chapter of one man's life, but the symbolic end of America's Gilded Age. Rockefeller was born in 1839 in a modest farmhouse in Richford, New York. By the time of his death in 1937, the world was unrecognizable. He had lived through the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the automobile, the spread of electricity, the First World War, and the Great Depression. In his later years, newspapers often marveled at how this elderly man, with his distinctive bald head, round glasses, and ever-present smile, had spanned nearly a century of transformation. He was, in some ways, a living monument to capitalism's triumphs and contradictions. Unlike his earlier years of secrecy, Rockefeller in retirement cultivated a new image. He became known as a publicly cheerful figure, giving out dimes to children and strangers, a habit that fascinated and sometimes puzzled onlookers. His appearances often made headlines. He was seen attending church regularly, singing hymns with vigor. He gave interviews where he emphasized the virtues of hard work, thrift, and faith. He seemed, in old age, to relish the role of kindly grandfather far removed from the stern tycoon who once battled rivals in oil fields and courtrooms. This transformation was deliberate. It softened his reputation and helped distance him from the lingering anger many Americans felt toward Standard Oil. Rockefeller spent much of his later years at his estate, Pocantico Hills, in Westchester County, New York. The estate had been developed into a sprawling complex with manicured gardens, farmland, and mansions for his family. Though he lived comfortably, his personal habits remained famously simple. He ate modest meals, often plain and carefully measured to preserve health. He adhered to strict routines, including early rising and daily walks. He enjoyed golf, becoming an enthusiastic player well into his 80s and 90s. Visitors often noted that despite his unimaginable wealth, Rockefeller lived with a degree of restraint that seemed almost old-fashioned. The Great Depression of the 1930s cast a long shadow over Rockefeller's final years. While millions of Americans struggled, Rockefeller's fortune, though diminished with falling stock prices, remained vast. To some, he was a reminder of capitalism's inequalities, a man who had more money than entire nations at a time when ordinary families lost homes and livelihoods. Yet, to others, his continued donations to universities, public health programs, and relief efforts offered a measure of stability in uncertain times. He became, willingly or not, a symbol of the broader debate Was wealth in private hands a danger to democracy, or could it be harnessed for the common good? Rockefeller's later years were also marked by the prominence of his descendants. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., became a major philanthropist in his own right, funding projects such as the restoration of colonial Williamsburg and the construction of Rockefeller Center in New York City. The family name, once associated with ruthless monopoly, was increasingly tied to public service, conservation, and cultural institutions. Rockefeller's grandchildren would go on to become politicians, bankers, and civic leaders, extending the dynasty well into the 20th century. By the mid-1930s, Rockefeller was one of the most famous men alive, not for his business battles, but for the strange duality of his legacy: ruthless capitalist in youth, smiling benefactor in age. He had lived long enough to see himself transformed in the public imagination. Yet one question lingered: was this transformation genuine, or was it carefully managed an effort to rewrite history while the man himself was still alive? On the morning of May 23, 1937, John D. Rockefeller passed away at his Florida estate in Ormond Beach. He was 97 years old, just shy of his 98th birthday. News of his death spread rapidly across the globe. In the United States and abroad, newspapers ran headlines announcing the passing of America's first billionaire. His death marked not just the end of a man's life, but also the symbolic close of a chapter in American capitalism. Rockefeller had been a living connection to the industrial age of oil, railroads, and steel. Now, as the world entered a new era defined by the lingering depression and the looming threat of another global war, his passing invited reflection, controversy, and no small amount of fascination. The press response was telling. Some obituaries celebrated Rockefeller as a builder of modern America, a man whose vision of efficiency and scale had helped turn the U.S. into an industrial powerhouse. They cited his role in lowering the price of kerosene, improving fuel distribution, and funding universities and medical research. Others were far less forgiving. Editorials reminded readers of the monopoly abuses of Standard Oil, the broken rivals, and the bitter strikes of workers who lived in poverty while Rockefeller accumulated millions. In many papers, praise and criticism appeared side by side, acknowledgement of a life too complex to summarize in simple terms. Rockefeller's funeral was a relatively quiet affair, reflecting his own preference for simplicity. It was held in Cleveland, Ohio, the city where his business empire had first taken shape nearly 70 years earlier. The service was attended by family, close friends, and a select group of business associates. Religious readings emphasized humility and service, echoing Rockefeller's lifelong Baptist faith. Unlike the spectacular funerals of some industrialists, there were no grand processions or state-like ceremonies. Yet, outside the church, crowds gathered. Some came out of curiosity, others from genuine respect, and still others to witness the end of an era. For ordinary Americans, Rockefeller's death stirred mixed emotions. To those struggling in the Depression, he remained a reminder of wealth's unequal distribution. To others, especially in regions that had benefited from his philanthropy, he was remembered as a benefactor whose fortune had funded schools, hospitals, and cultural centers. Interestingly, some newspapers noted that people continued to tell stories of Rockefeller dimes, the small coins he had often given to strangers. These simple tokens, passed hand to hand, became a metaphor for the way Rockefeller lingered in public imagination, part curiosity, part legend, part contradiction, abroad. Rockefeller was both admired and distrusted. European commentators saw him as the ultimate example of American capitalism, a system that produced unprecedented fortunes but also raised fears of concentrated power in places where his philanthropy had supported international health campaigns. As malaria prevention or hookworm eradication, his name carried a different weight. In these regions, Rockefeller was remembered as the financier who helped save countless lives, not the monopolist of oil. Thus, even in death, his image was fragmented: capitalist, titan, philanthropist, monopolist, benefactor, legend, contradiction, transition. To the Rockefeller dynasty, as the obituaries made clear, Rockefeller's passing did not mean the end of his influence. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., was already a towering figure in philanthropy, funding monumental projects like the Rockefeller Center in Manhattan. His grandsons were stepping into political and business roles, signaling that the Rockefeller dynasty would continue shaping American life for decades. The world watched with interest. Would the heirs soften or sharpen the legacy of the man who had built the fortune? Rockefeller's vast fortune been a blessing to society, or had it come at too great a cost? The answer, perhaps, would depend on how his descendants chose to wield the power he had left behind. When John D. Rockefeller died in 1937, his body was laid in the ground, but his influence lived on in ways that extended far beyond the fortune he left behind. His legacy, complicated, contested, and inescapable, continued to shape business, philanthropy, and even the American imagination of wealth. At the time of his death, Rockefeller's personal wealth was estimated at $1.4 billion, staggering sum, even after decades of philanthropy. To put this into perspective, adjusted for inflation, Rockefeller's fortune would exceed $400 billion today, making him one of the wealthiest individuals in history. Unlike many fortunes, which dissipated over generations, his wealth had been carefully managed through trusts and foundations to ensure its continuation. This careful stewardship meant that the Rockefeller family remained prominent in finance, politics, culture, and philanthropy long after John D.'s passing. Rockefeller's charitable foundations became permanent fixtures in American and global life. Among the most enduring legacies were the Rockefeller Foundation, supporting advancements in medicine, agriculture, and public health. Its work helped to develop vaccines, improve global food supply, and combat diseases like malaria. The University of Chicago, founded with Rockefeller's endowment, it grew into one of the world's leading universities, with dozens of Nobel laureates. Rockefeller Center in New York City, built under John D. Rockefeller Jr. It became not just a commercial hub, but a cultural symbol of New York's modern identity. Through these institutions, Rockefeller's money outlived him, quietly, influencing lives across generations. The Rockefeller family became something like American royalty. Though they never pursued a throne, their presence was felt in boardrooms, politics, and philanthropy. John D. Rockefeller Jr. carried on the family's charitable mission, emphasizing cultural preservation, including funding the restoration of colonial Williamsburg. Nelson Rockefeller, John D.'s grandson, rose to political prominence, serving as governor of New York and later as vice president of the United States. Other descendants continued to manage trusts, foundations, and charitable projects. The Rockefeller name itself became shorthand for vast wealth and quiet power. Even as his philanthropy flourished, the debate over Rockefeller's moral standing remained unresolved. Historians, economists, and ordinary people continued to ask, was Rockefeller's empire building a ruthless suppression of competition, or was it an efficient modernization of industry? Did his philanthropy outweigh the harm caused by his monopoly? Was he a genius of organization, or simply a man who exploited timing, regulation, and power? This tension between ruthless capitalist and generous benefactor became central to the mythology of Rockefeller. Long after his death, Rockefeller remained a figure woven into American culture. His name appeared in textbooks, business schools, novels, and films. The very phrase, Rockefeller rich, became a cultural shorthand for unimaginable wealth. Yet unlike many wealthy figures whose influence fades, Rockefeller's story continued to feel relevant precisely because it touched on questions that remain unresolved. How much wealth is too much? What responsibility do the rich have toward society? Can money earned through domination be redeemed through generosity? Perhaps the most striking element of Rockefeller's legacy is its paradoxical nature. He was both the monopolist who destroyed competitors and the philanthropist who saved millions through medicine and education. He was both the richest man in history and a man who gave away dimes to children. He was both the embodiment of capitalism's power and an advocate for personal thrift, humility, and faith. This paradox ensured that Rockefeller would never be remembered in simple terms as you. Imagine Rockefeller's life now, stretching from a modest boy in Ohio to the world's first billionaire. You might consider the broader question: does great wealth define the person who earns it, or does it reveal the deeper truths of human nature, ambition, fear, generosity, and control? In Rockefeller's case, perhaps the answer is that his fortune did not so much define him as it revealed the contradictions of the modern age itself. Story 6: Sickness on the Trail. Ordinary illness, extraordinary loss. When we imagine the Great Migration westward across the United States in the 19th century, our minds often wander to sweeping landscapes, sendless plains, wagon trains stretching into the horizon, or snow-capped peaks rising in the distance. But for the tens of thousands of men, women, and children who made that journey, the greatest challenge was not always steep mountains or swollen rivers. More often, it was sickness. For those traveling along the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails, disease was an invisible but ever-present companion. In fact, historians estimate that for every mile of the trail, one grave was dug. The West may have promised land, gold, or freedom, but the path to reach it was marked by the ordinary illnesses of the 19th century's mall infections, fevers, flux, dysentery, and even toothaches that could become life-threatening without treatment. In many ways, disease was a more constant threat than attacks by Native Americans, wild animals, or starvation. The greatest killers were illnesses like cholera, spread by contaminated water, causing violent vomiting and diarrhea that could kill within hours. Dysentery, often called the flux, which slowly drained the strength of its victims. Scurvy, the result of long diets without fresh fruits or vegetables, measles and smallpox, which swept through wagon camps and left scars on those who survived, typhoid fever, born of poor sanitation and the flies that gathered around refuse. The trail was, in many ways, a perfect breeding ground for illness. Wagons stopped near rivers where thousands before had camped, leaving behind waste and shallow graves. Food was limited, water was often unsafe, and medical knowledge was little more than guesswork. Most wagon trains did not include trained physicians. Instead, families relied on home remedies, practical experience, and a mixture of folklore and faith. Common treatments included laudanum, an opium-based painkiller, given for everything from headaches to dysentery; calomel, a mercury-based purgative, believed to cleanse the body but often poisoning the patient; herbal teas from roots and leaves, used to soothe fevers or calm upset stomachs; bloodletting, still practiced by some, though its effectiveness was doubtful. When illness struck, the wagon master might call a halt, but often the sick were carried along in jolting wagons, with little rest or comfort. A child with measles might lie next to a barrel of flour, covered only with a quilt, while the caravan pressed on. The emigrants were not ignorant. They developed small but important survival strategies, boiling water when they could, though fuel was often scarce, burying the dead deep, though shallow graves were common due to exhaustion and rocky soil, spacing wagons apart to limit the spread of infection, though this was not always possible. Yet, despite these precautions, illness swept through camps with devastating regularity. Accounts from diaries and letters paint a picture of quiet tragedy. A mother would write of losing a child to cholera one morning, then describe how the wagons moved on by afternoon, leaving a small mound of earth behind. Travelers spoke of roads lined with markers, wooden crosses, rocks, or nothing at all. One emigrant wrote simply, "The graves are so frequent, we cease to count them." For those who survived, the memory of sickness was often sharper than the memory of mountains or rivers. The loss of a father, mother, or child on the trail transformed the dream of a new life into a bitter reminder of the fragility of life in the 19th century. When you imagine yourself on that long journey westward, what would have frightened you? More the river crossings and mountain passes, or the unseen enemy of illness that could strike at any hour? By the time a wagon train had been on the road for several weeks, sickness was no longer surprising. It was expected. Families came to accept that a cough could deepen into fever, that an upset stomach might signal something far worse. Yet the emigrants still pressed on. What else could they do? Turning back was unthinkable, and to stop for too long meant falling. Behind the safety of the group, the sick were often cared for in wagons, their bodies jostling with every bump in the road. Mothers nursed children while still walking beside the team of oxen, and older children were expected to tend to younger siblings, even as they themselves grew weak from the same disease. Nursing was rudimentary, but heartfelt. Cool rags were laid on hot foreheads. Sick children were spoon-fed bits of broth, often from precious stores of dried beef or rice. Songs and prayers filled the wagons, not so much to heal the sick as to comfort the living. The sharing of remedies became a form of community survival. A family with dried peppermint leaves might lend them to soothe another's stomach. Those who had tinctures of camphor or ginger often shared them, though not without worry. Supplies were always limited, and every gift meant risking one's own family later. When death came, it rarely allowed time for mourning. The trail could not stop for long. Graves were dug quickly, often in hard ground, sometimes shallow, sometimes deep enough to keep scavengers away. Burials were plain. A prayer was spoken by the wagon master or a family elder. A hymn was sung softly. If voices could be found, a mound of earth was raised, sometimes with stones piled to protect against wolves, to disguise graves from animals and sometimes from grave robbers. Wagons were often rolled over the site to leave no clear marker. Other times, families carved names into boards, though wind and weather would erase them within years. One diary entry described the routine starkly. We buried him before breakfast and moved on before the sun was high. The pace of the journey demanded it. To linger too long risked the safety of the whole train. The grief carried by emigrants was immense, but rarely expressed. A father might walk silently beside the oxen, lips pressed thin, after burying a child that morning. A mother, surrounded by the laughter of other families, might keep her sorrow private. As her hands busied themselves with cooking or sewing, some families lost more than one member. A wagon might set out from Missouri with 7 souls and arrive in Oregon with only 3. The westward dream demanded a high price, and families paid it without ceremony. The emotional strain was compounded by the sheer familiarity of loss. Graves became part of the landscape. Travelers wrote of entire hillsides covered with markers, of rivers where children had drowned, of ridges lined with wooden boards inscribed with names. In a sense, grief became another burden packed in the wagons, an invisible load, heavier with every mile. Faith served as the greatest salve. Protestant hymns and Bible verses were common at burials. The Mormon emigrants, especially, carried a deep sense of mission and believed their sacrifices were part of a divine plan. Even among those less devout, there was comfort in words like, "We will meet again." Religious belief gave a framework to suffering, making the journey seem less like a random trial and more like a test of spirit. Yet faith could only soften the loss, it could not erase it. Many who reached Oregon or California carried grief for the rest of their lives, telling stories of lost children or spouses even decades later. Historians estimate that disease killed more than 30,000 emigrants on the overland trails during the mid-19th century. The number is staggering, though often overshadowed by tales of mountain crossings and wagon attacks. But if you imagine the trail as a great thread across the continent, woven with hardship and hope, then the graves were knots in that fabric marking, where dreams had ended and where others were forced to keep walking forward. If you had been among those travelers, would you have marked the grave of your loved one, knowing the sign might fade, or would you have left no trace at all, hoping only the memory would live on in your heart? When the great overland migrations of the 19th century slowed and eventually ceased, the prairie grasses grew back over the rutted tracks. The wagon roads became faint scars across the landscape, and the graves left behind slowly disappeared into earth and silence. But the memory of sickness on the trail, of ordinary illness shaping extraordinary lives, remained long after the last wagon crossed the mountains. For those who endured the journey, The sicknesses and the losses were rarely forgotten. Settlers who built cabins in Oregon, California, or Utah often carried with them the names of children buried along the Platte River, or wives left in shallow graves near the Sweetwater. Some settlers told these stories aloud, passing them to children and grandchildren as cautionary tales of hardship. Others never spoke of them again. Silence was its own kind of remembrance, a way of sealing grief away so life could continue. Yet diaries, letters, and memoirs survive. They speak of everyday tragedy in spare, matter-of-fact language. Mary took the fever and died. We left her by the river. 2 children were buried today, but the wagons moved on. We have lost so many, but the land calls us still. These quiet lines capture the emotional landscape of the trail more clearly than any grand tale of adventure. Historians have estimated that the overland trails became one of the largest burial grounds in North America. Tens of thousands were laid to rest along the Platte, the Snake, the Humboldt, and countless unnamed streams and prairies. Travelers often remarked that no day passed without seeing a grave. Some were marked with names, others were anonymous, quickly forgotten. In some stretches of the trail, a rider could pass mound after mound, each representing a family who had stopped, wept, and then moved on. In this way, the westward road was paved not just with determination, but with grief. Every settlement in the far west was, in part, built on the sacrifices of those who never arrived. For survivors, the sickness and deaths on the trail often became a measure of endurance. Families who reached the valleys of California or Oregon spoke of themselves as tested by fate. The losses gave their survival weight and meaning. Some took pride in having kept their family whole. Others bore guilt for those left behind. One emigrant, reflecting years later, wrote, "I made it, but I wonder if the price was worth it. We lost so much, and yet we called it success." The sicknesses of the trail taught hard lessons that echoed through generations. The fragility of health, how quickly life could be undone by something as small as contaminated water or spoiled food. The value of community, how wagon trains depended on sharing remedies, care, and labor in times of sickness. The endurance of memory, how even unmarked graves shaped the collective story of the West. These were not glamorous lessons, but they were real, and they endured in the memories of families long after the excitement of reaching the Pacific coast had faded. Today, the Oregon Trail and other migration routes are remembered through monuments, museums, and preserved ruts in the earth. But the true legacy lies in the quieter history, the unnamed children, the ordinary illnesses, the countless graves that never saw stone or marker. Every family who crossed knew that sickness was as much a part of the journey as rivers or mountains. The story of westward expansion is therefore not only about ambition and discovery, but also about the everyday endurance of loss. If you stood today on the grassy banks of the Platte or along the sagebrush plains of the Snake, you might see nothing but land and sky. Yet beneath your feet lie traces of those ordinary lives, swallowed by earth, but still part of history. The question lingers, when we remember the great migrations, should we honor more the trails carved into the soil, or the countless quiet graves left behind? The lamp across the street, the first glow. You've been listening to boring pastimes, where the past whispers instead of shouts. May these quiet stories of forgotten lives remind you that history is not only found in kings and battles, but in the ordinary footsteps, the daily tasks, and the slow passage of time. Until next time, rest well, and may sleep carry you gently forward.